MPs arrived on Parliament Hill today, battle lines drawn. On one end, the Liberal government and its pre-election pitch to Canadians, a budget chock full of big spending promises unveiled yesterday. On the other end, the official opposition. They're calling that budget a cover-up and say they're determined to keep the spotlight on the SNC Levelling controversy. Then, before those two narratives collided in question period, this happened.
People going into caucus after that incident last week where you revealed to us about the Prime Minister's behaviour?
I'm going, so yeah.
I have just been notified by my office that Celina CaesarChavannes has decided to sit as an independent. I want to thank her for her service to the Liberal Party and to her constituents, and wish her the best in her continued service to constituents.
While I support the values and the principles of the Liberal Party, that it might be good, since that message did go out, that I sit as an independent for the rest of the term that I'm here.
That was Celina CaesarChavannes talking to our Chris Rands exclusively after she announced that she was quitting, or we heard through the Prime Minister that she was quitting the Liberal caucus. For more on the fallout from that resignation, I'm joined by the CBC's Evan Dyer. Not really a resignation, that's the wrong term for it. For that exit from Liberal caucus, Evan. Yes. Tell us what led up to that.
Well, you know, there's a bit of a backstory that began on Twitter. I guess you could say it's ending there too, with a bit of an explanation we just saw on Twitter. Essentially, Celina CaesarChavannes, who began her career as a Liberal MP as the parliamentary secretary of the Prime Minister, has decided that she doesn't want to continue in politics. And she made that decision known, it seems, to the Prime Minister a while ago. She'd already walked away from that particular post, and now it appears doesn't plan to run in October. And she approached him about that. She says she tried to explain to him that it was having a negative effect on her family. She said that he was very unsympathetic. She put out a tweet a couple of weeks ago where she took him to task and suggested that he was a hypocrite for the lines that he was then using to describe how he was going to respond to the SNC Levelling scandal. You may remember that at the time he was saying this was a breakdown of communication. We have to learn to listen more to our cabinet colleagues. And she essentially said, well, okay, if we're going to be talking about listening, remember when I came up to you.
She said, I did come to you recently twice. Remember your reaction.
Remember your reaction. That was left hanging. But then subsequently she went and she gave an interview to the Globe and Mail, to Laura Stone, where she expanded on that. And she said essentially that he had yelled at her when she tried to approach him, that he had subsequently apologized. He'd asked her to delay her announcement that she was leaving politics because he was concerned, she said, that about the optics of two women of color leaving on the same day. This was on the day that Jody WilsonRab left cabinet. And then that there was a subsequent phone call also that ended in yelling. And now we see her resignation, and initially it appeared to be a similar kind of resignation to the ones we saw from the two cabinet members, Jody WilsonRab and Jane Philpott, a kind of indignant resignation where she's taking a shot at the Prime Minister. But it appears from her comments to our colleague Chris Rands and from a tweet that she just put out, which I'll read, that she's actually taking the blame more on herself. So in a tweet that just went out a short while ago, she says, "The interview I gave last week to the Globe and Mail has had unintended effects on those I care about. Although that was not the intention, it was the consequence, and I am sorry. I no longer want to distract from the great work my caucus colleagues are doing. Love and hugs, C." So some regrets, it seems, about that interview, and trying to leave without doing any further damage.
Yeah, and she spoke to Chris, our producer, for a little while. We're going to play the full exchange in a bit, but I want to also ask you about the other big stories, I should say, the budget, SNC Levelling. We know there's sort of a clash of who wants to be talking about what. We know also that the Conservatives sort of employed another tactic today in order to hear again what they keep saying, like, let her speak, hear again from Jody WilsonRab. Tell us about that.
That's right. So, of course, everybody will recall that this was before the Justice Committee, and then on Monday, the Liberal members of the Justice Committee, who have a majority, 6 out of 10, wrote a letter saying that enough has been heard, enough testimony has been heard, the public can come to its own conclusions about what happened. There's no reason to call her back. This investigation, as far as we're concerned, is done within the Justice Committee. The Ethics Commissioner will continue, of course, with his. The Conservatives were indignant about that, and we saw that carry over into the budget yesterday when Bill Morneau was prevented from speaking. But today, we saw in question period the leader of the Conservative opposition, Andrew Scheer, ask a question of one of his own colleagues, Bob Zimmer. Now, Bob Zimmer is chair of another committee because there's a standing order in Parliament that gives the chair of the Ethics Committee to the opposition. So this is unusually a committee chaired by the opposition. And Andrew Scheer asked him, will you be looking into this matter? He said he'd received letters from 3 other members of that committee, all of them opposition members, of course, asking him to do so and that he would. Does that mean then that they will now be calling Jody WilsonRab to yet another parliamentary committee? I don't think it does, because the chair of a committee doesn't decide on its agenda on his own. He's not able to simply say, we'll investigate this, we'll call this or that witness. This is a majority decision. And as on other committees, the Liberals have a majority, 6 out of 10. And it seems very unlikely that if they didn't want Jody WilsonRab coming back to the Justice Committee, that they're going to want to bring her to the Ethics Committee.
At this hour, there's also some more wild stuff going on in the House of Commons. There's more tactics being employed essentially by the Conservatives to force more discussion on SNC Levelling. Can you kind of break it down? Because it's a bit, you've been talking about it all day, I know, and you've done a great job of making something very dense, more understandable for the rest of us.
Yeah, dense and procedural.
Yeah.
So essentially, there are estimates that have to be voted on, right? We're at the end of a fiscal year, and there's operating and capital budgets that have to be voted on by April 1st. And we saw 257 motions introduced by the Conservative Party questioning various line items of that spending, each one of which has to be voted on. It doesn't involve a debate, but it does involve a vote. And votes take time. They take about 10 to 12 minutes when everybody's playing ball. If people want to vote slowly, they can drag it out even longer. So what happens now is that nobody will be able to leave, really, or at least the Liberals will have to maintain enough people in Parliament to have a guaranteed majority, because these are money issues on which a government can fall if it loses a vote.
So they have to be there.
They all have to be there, or at least hanging around in the lobby, until all 257 of these motions have been defeated. That's going to take, by my count, something like 50 hours of voting, 40 to 50 hours of voting, assuming things go well, to get through. And what does that mean, of course, for the Liberal Party? It means that its members are unable to fan out across the country and talk about the budget. And that is typically what you would expect to see a governing party doing when something like this, when a budget has come out, particularly an election year budget. Instead, they're going to have to stay right here in Ottawa, close to the chamber, in order to prevent the government falling. At the same time, it must be said, there's no indication that the Conservative Party would actually like to bring the government down, much less the New Democrats. This appears to be a tactic. It's not really an effort to make the government fall.
And I think the Prime Minister has responded to this, right? I think we might have a clip of that. Let's play that for a second.
The Conservatives absolutely, at all costs, do not want to talk about the economy and do not want us to talk about the economy either. They continue to play politics when Canadians want to see how they're going to build a better future for themselves, for their kids, how they're going to prepare for the changing workforce of tomorrow, and that's exactly what our budget does.
So a real reiteration there of what we heard yesterday when we heard the drowning out, et cetera, this idea that the Conservatives are saying you're using the budget to get away from SNC Levelling, and the Prime Minister is saying you're accusing me of that because you don't want to talk about your own plan.
Yeah, he's in fact essentially saying you're using SNC Levelling to avoid talking about the budget and the economy.
It goes round and round and round.
Goes around and around. And of course, we do see that this works, because here he is at an affordable housing event, which was a major plank of the budget, hoping to talk about making houses more affordable for young people too, a vote that he won on in 2015 that he needs this year, and instead more questions about cabinet and caucus drama.
All right, thank you, Evan. Appreciate all that information and the update. The CBC's Evan Dyer. We showed you some of what MP Celina Caesar-Chavannes had to say after quitting the Liberal caucus. As we mentioned, the CBC's Chris Rands caught up with her earlier this afternoon. Here's that full exchange.
I just think it was important to, I understand that there's a lot of people that supported me that were disappointed in, what I did, doing the interview that I did. And I think that it's important to understand that, while I support the values and the principles of the Liberal Party, that it might be good, since that message did go out, that I sit as an independent for the rest of the term that I'm here.
Okay. And what's your message to the people of Whitby?
The message to the people of Whitby is that, I love representing them, but I don't want to cause them any more grief, especially the ones who are very strong Liberal supporters. I don't want to cause them that grief. And so I think that it's probably the best thing for me to do is to sit as an independent.
And are you and the Prime Minister okay now, or do you still have issues? Or
No, I don't have any comment. I just want to speak to my constituents in Whitby. Thank you.
Earlier, we talked about the departure of Celina Caesar-Chavannes from the Liberal caucus. We're also talking about the budget and what's going on in the House of Commons, and we want to get both the government and the opposition's response to all of that. We're joined now by Jennifer O'Connell. She's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance. Pierre Poilievre is the Conservative finance critic, and Peter Julian is the NDP's finance critic. All three join me right here in studio. Nice to see you all. Thank you for your time. Ms. O'Connell, I'm going to start with you, and I want to get to the budget and everything that's going on in the House of Commons, but I do have to ask you about Celina Caesar-Chavannes and her decision to leave the Liberal caucus. She says that the interview she gave to the Globe and Mail, in which she said, and she described being met with hostility when she approached the Prime Minister and anger, she said it had unintended effects on those I care about. Do you think she should have left caucus?
I don't know. That's a decision entirely for Celina, but Celina is a member from Whitby, which is just a couple towns over from me in our region. So I'm really sad to see her leave, but I wish her all the best, and I know she'll do great things. I can't speak.
Were you angered by her comments in the Globe and Mail? Did you have a reaction to them? Did you speak with her about them?
I wasn't angered by them in the sense that that was her experience. I've had a very different experience in my dealings with the Prime Minister, and I think Celina has made a decision that she feels comfortable with, and like I said, I wish her well.
Okay, Mr. Poilievre, let me ask you about what's going on in the House right now. And we know, obviously, what happened yesterday with the budget being tabled, the drowning out of Minister Morneau. Tonight, MPs are expected to stay overnight to do votes that your party has, in a way, set the table for. Do you think that's the best way to prove your point about Jody WilsonRab?
It might be the only way. The Prime Minister used his majority to shut down the investigation into him that the Justice Committee was holding. He did so before allowing Jody WilsonRab to complete her unfinished testimony, and before 6 of the accused figures in his administration came forward and testified about the pressure and the interference she says they applied to get SNC Levelling's charges dropped. We want to get to the truth, and we're going to use every parliamentary tool in the toolkit to end the cover-up.
How does this get to the truth? How does keeping them there for votes? I take your point about the committee being shut down, but how does this actually accomplish that?
Well, we're going to, the signal to the Prime Minister is that he's going to have to be 100% seized with the House of Commons until such time as he tells the truth. He is covering up the truth in this matter. There are numerous factual contradictions. He has, for example, said that Jody WilsonRab never raised any concerns with him. Well, we know now that's not true. She testified that she raised concerns with him about his interference as early as September 17th. He claimed early on that SNC Levelling might leave Canada altogether if it didn't get the charges shelved. And now we know that that's impossible, and the CEO today...
Clear, does staying overnight in the House actually get Jody WilsonRab back before a committee?
Yeah, I think it will ultimately. Look, the Prime Minister would be better to go to the finale rather than through a direct line, rather than going in a circuitous route. And the pressure is going to mount. It is going to continue. He's going to have to back down. He might as well do it today, and then we don't have to keep him here all night voting. But he's going to have to come clean at some point, and the sooner the better for him and all of us.
Mr. Julian, your party has been calling for an independent inquiry. We heard in the House of Commons today that the Ethics Committee could perhaps look into this. Is that enough?
I think the Ethics Committee should be looking into it. The public inquiry call that Jagmeet Singh has put forward is absolutely essential. Canadians care about this issue.
Even if the Ethics Committee is looking into it?
Yes. We've got the Ethics Commissioner looking into this. This is pretty profound. I mean, the Liberals have lost 2 cabinet ministers. They've lost a member of Parliament. We also saw a number of other resignations. For the Liberals to continue to say that there's simply nothing to see here, I think is disingenuous to the maximum. And Canadians see that. What Canadians want is the government to be transparent. That's what Mr. Trudeau committed to back in 2015. And he's been anything but. And the revelations today that SNC Levelling never raised the issue of jobs and understood that they're committed to stay in Canada, I think just adds more fuel to the fire. And Mr. Trudeau can resolve all of this by allowing Jody Wilson-Rab to speak and by calling a public inquiry.
Let me quickly ask you about that, Ms. O'Connell, before I switch to the budget, because in that interview with CP, the CEO of SNC Levelling did say that he didn't raise the specter of 9,000 job losses. He never said that explicitly to your government. Have you been misleading Canadians when you say that those jobs are at risk?
No, because I think what even Ms. Wilson-Rab said in her own testimony was having conversations about impacts to jobs are entirely appropriate when considering a deferred prosecution agreement. And so the fact that a government asked, or any member of the government asked questions about whether things were considered or not, doesn't have to come
But that's not entirely what you said. I mean, the people I've interviewed from your party after this have said, there's a difference of opinion. We're standing up for jobs.
Yeah.
Others are not. But those jobs, where's the proof that they were entirely at risk if even the CEO of the company is saying he didn't explicitly make that argument?
But there were even conversations in the testimony about layoffs at SNC that triggered conversations around this. The point of the conversations around jobs were to ensure that if a DPA is appropriate, and that was again always in the Attorney General's, it was her discretion to make and her decision to make alone, but were these factors looked at and considered? Nobody was suggesting that there was some report or some.
Well, actually, Mr. Butts did say there were briefings from the finance department. That was the only.
They were having the conversations about whether or not there would be impacts.
So there is no. What you're saying is there is no evidence really that those jobs were certainly at risk. I understand the conversation.
No, but
our
conversations that the testimony brought forward was that there were questions asked about the jobs that could be at stake. And that's exactly what the former Attorney General said was appropriate, to have those types of conversations in any matter. Frankly, I'd be disappointed if our government wasn't focused
I do want to talk about the budget,
jobs.
but I know you both want to respond to that quickly. I mean, is that true? Is that conversation not one that should happen if you're in government?
But there are no jobs at stake in this criminal prosecution. And let's take, for example, the Prime Minister's claim that the headquarters would up and move if Jody Wilson-Rab didn't immediately intervene to shelve the criminal trial. That was impossible because the company has an agreement with the Quebec Pension Plan to stay in Montreal for another 6 years, where they just, by the way, signed a 20-year lease on their mortgage, on their building, and are renovating it to keep it there. They have $52 billion of projects across the country that have to be done in Canada. They have
But they can't build on any new ones, right?
They absolutely can. They absolutely can. And I'll tell you why. The government can provide an exemption to SNC, even if it is convicted of an offense. They're working on creating that exemption, which means they didn't need to shelve the trial in order to preserve SNC's ability to bid on federal contracts. All of this to say, if there were no jobs at stake, as we're now learning from the CEO is the case, then who were the Liberals really protecting by going to such lengths to shelve this criminal prosecution?
Mr. Julian, isn't the idea of raising the possibility, I take everyone's point, I know the CEO even said it himself, but if you had a Canadian company who couldn't bid on those federal infrastructure, if that is the case for 10 years, is that worth discussing if you're the government?
I think what's worth discussing is the fact that the people most intimately involved in this case are resigning one after the next or stepping out of the Liberal caucus. That there is obviously grounds for the public to know more. The public deserves to know more. And the revelations today, both the resignation of the member from Whitby, but also the fact that the SNC Levelling CEO is now very clear that he did not make the statements that the Liberal government and Mr. Trudeau were purporting to him, that all shows that a public inquiry is needed. This scandal continues to grow. And despite the fact that the Liberals try to shut it down, the public becomes more and more questioning about what Mr. Trudeau's motives were, why he did these things, and what he did. And the Liberals are just going to have to come clean.
I'm running out of time, but I want to ask you each one question about the budget. So first to you, Ms. O'Connell. I know that your government announced measures aimed specifically at younger people who are trying to get into the housing market. Are you worried, or should Canadians be concerned that those will drive up the price of houses?
No, because again, these are already young people that are not in the market and have no possibility of being in the market. And part of these measures, it wasn't just one measure on housing, it was also measures to increase supply. There were measures to work to ensure that municipalities, there's a challenge to municipality, well, it's not just municipalities.
If there are more people who are able to get in the market, can't that potentially raise already very high prices?
Well, but this is something that has been looked at by the Minister of Finance to ensure that we are protecting the housing market, but that's why I said that it wasn't just one measure, because that is something we want to make sure that this doesn't just increase the prices in certain markets specifically, but that's why we're also looking at the issues of supply challenges in certain markets. And so it's a combination of measures to ensure that an additional group of people can have that opportunity.
Mr. Poilievre, your party said that the government spent too much yesterday, that the spending was too high. Would you kill the measures announced for people trying to get into the housing market?
Well, the devil will be in the details with all of these proposals. What we do know is that Trudeau's $20 billion promise-breaking deficit will drive up taxes if he's reelected. It's the old Liberal trick. You spend like crazy to distract from scandal before the election and then raise taxes to pay for it all after the election. And if you're a young person trying to buy a house and you take a big hit on your tax bill, you're less able to pay for your mortgage.
But what spending wouldn't you spend then? Like, what would you...
$35 billion infrastructure bank is a waste of money designed to back up the profits of big construction companies like SNC Levelling, one of the only companies that has benefited from it so far. That's one that's gone. The Asian Infrastructure Bank, $500 million to build pipelines, ironically, and roads in China. Gonzo. And we won't be increasing spending at a rate of 7% a year, which is 3 times the combined rate of inflation and population growth. We will slow the spending to the level that taxpayers and the economy can support.
Mr. Julian, your party has talked about how those housing proposals don't go far enough, that instead there should be investment in a new stock of affordable housing, 500,000 of them, and your party keeps using the word now. How much will that cost?
Well, we already did this after the Second World War. You'll recall we built 300,000 units right across the country. It takes about $60,000 a year to keep somebody on the street. So these investments would be critical. And the reality is, it's not that the budget doesn't go far enough. The budget, as analysts have already said, actually increases the difficulty, the competition that millennials are facing in the housing market when the federal government refuses to take its responsibility and build new affordable housing units, cooperative housing and social housing. And Canadian millennials are the most indebted in the industrialized world, in the same way that Canadian families are the most indebted in the industrialized world. It's because of wrong-headed government thinking to date, where the supply in housing has not been met, that we are in the situation we're in.
But how much would that cost? I take your argument, but that's 500,000 homes
much
is a
less
lot.
than the $14 billion that the Liberals splurged on Bay Street in the fall-November update.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I've kept you all here long enough. I really appreciate your time this evening. Thanks to Jennifer O'Connell, Peter Julian, and Pierre Poilievre.